The morning sun rose over the Montana territory like molten gold spilling across the mountains, and Clara Dawson was already at work. Her palms, raw and blistered, gripped the wooden handle of her hammer as she pounded another nail into a log that refused to sit straight. The sound echoed across the empty land, steady, stubborn, and lonely. Each swing was a declaration, "I will not give up." The land she stood on wasn't much, just 40 acres of wind, rock, and stubborn grass, but it was hers. Her late husband's will had promised her this patch of dirt, and after his death, when the world told her to sell and move back east, Clara refused. She'd buried enough dreams already. This one she meant to keep alive. Around her, the beginnings of a cabin took shape. Rough-hewn logs stacked waist-high, uneven corners, gaps where daylight streamed through. Her arms ached from lifting, cutting, and hauling wood from the nearby grove. She wasn't strong enough for this kind of work, not really, but she'd learned to work through pain. The first week she'd cried until her throat was raw. The second week she'd stopped noticing the tears altogether. The townsfolk down in Pine Creek said she'd lost her mind. "A woman alone can't survive a Montana winter," they whispered. The shopkeeper offered to buy her land for half its worth, warning her that snow would bury her before Christmas. Clara only smiled, tight and polite, and bought another box of nails. Every night she lit a small fire, cooked beans or whatever she could afford, and sat on a half-finished porch staring at the stars. They burned sharp and cold, too many to count. Sometimes she imagined her late husband among them, watching her work herself half to death to build something she'd once dreamed they'd share. Other nights, she didn't let herself think at all. The wilderness wasn't gentle. Wolves howled in the distance, and once she woke to find bear tracks in the mud just yards from her bedroll. When storms came, she huddled under canvas, praying the wind wouldn't tear it away. But even through fear and exhaustion, there was something fierce in her spirit. A fire that refused to go out. She worked for more than a roof and walls. She worked for dignity, for the right to wake each day and answer to no one but herself. By the third week, her hands had toughened, her muscles had learned the rhythm of labor. Sweat rolled down her back as she wrestled another log into place. The air smelled of pine and sawdust, and when she stopped to catch her breath, she looked out at the land, the hills rolling toward blue-gray mountains, the creek cutting through the valley, and a slow, proud smile crept across her face. Then, movement caught her eye. Up on the ridge to the north, a dark figure sat astride a horse watching. The rider was tall, still as stone, his hat pulled low. The distance made him just a shape against the sky, but something about the way he sat, easy, quiet, unhurried, set her pulse racing. He didn't move, didn't wave, didn't speak, just watched. When she blinked, he was gone. Clara stood there for a long moment, hammer still in hand, listening to the echo of his departure. The prairie wind swept through her hair, carrying with it a strange feeling she couldn't name. Unease, maybe, or curiosity. She shrugged it off and turned back to her work. The next log wasn't going to lift itself, but that night, when she crawled into her bedroll beside the dying fire, she found a neatly stacked bundle of chopped firewood waiting by her tools. Fresh, clean cuts, not her doing. Someone had been there. Clara stared into the dark tree line, the flames crackling low beside her. Maybe she wasn't as alone as she thought. The next morning dawned cold and quiet, the kind of chill that slipped through seams and stung bare skin. Clara Dawson rose early, rubbing the sleep from her eyes as the frost on her bedroll crackled. When she stepped outside, the world was pale silver, the grass stiff underfoot, her breath a thin mist. But it wasn't the cold that made her pause. It was the pile of freshly chopped firewood still stacked neatly by her cabin wall. She crouched beside it, fingertips brushing over the smooth-cut ends. Whoever had left it knew how to handle an axe. Each piece was cleanly split, perfect in size. She looked toward the tree line, her heart thrumming. Had the man on the ridge done this? And if so, why? The thought unsettled her. In these parts, strangers didn't usually give without expecting something back. Still, as the wind bit sharper, she carried the wood inside, built a fire, and let the warmth soak into her bones. Gratitude warred with caution, but a small, foolish part of her was comforted knowing someone out there, someone silent, had taken the time to help. By midday, she was back at work, swinging her hammer in rhythm, the steady beat echoing across the valley. The sound carried far, she knew. Maybe that's why she wasn't surprised when, by late afternoon, the crunch of hooves broke through the quiet. Clara froze, fingers still on the hammer handle. From behind the grove, a horse stepped into view, big, chestnut-colored, dust clinging to its legs. The rider was tall and broad-shouldered, his face shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat. For a long moment, neither spoke. The only sound was the wind and the creak of saddle leather. Then he tipped his hat slightly and said, in a low voice rough as gravel, "Your beam's crooked." Clara blinked, startled. "Beg your pardon?" He dismounted in one smooth motion, moving with the quiet ease of a man who belonged to the land. Without asking, he walked up to the half-built wall, crouched, and set his gloved hand against the log. "If you notch it wrong, the whole frame'll lean. Won't last through snow." Annoyance flickered in her chest. She didn't need another man telling her what she couldn't do. "I've managed fine so far," she said, lifting her chin. He looked up then, and for the first time she saw his face, tanned skin, a day's worth of stubble, and eyes the color of storm clouds. They held no mockery, only quiet observation. "Didn't say you hadn't," he murmured. Then, after a pause, "Just saying, it could stand straighter." Before she could respond, he picked up her axe, turned toward a nearby log, and began trimming it with measured precision. The sound of wood splitting filled the clearing. Clara watched, torn between irritation and reluctant admiration. His movements were clean, practiced, each strike sure efficient. When he was done, he carried the beam back, set it in place, and tested it with a light knock. It fit perfectly. "There," he said simply, dusting off his gloves. Clara folded her arms. "You always fix other people's problems without asking?" He gave a small shrug. "Only when they're worth fixing." And with that, he turned to leave. "Wait," she called, half against her better judgment. "At least tell me your name." He paused, glanced over his shoulder. "Luke Calder," he said, voice low, steady. Then, with a tilt of his hat, he added, "You'll want to brace that wall before the next wind." Before she could thank or scold him, he swung back into the saddle and rode off toward the ridge, his silhouette shrinking against the reddening sky. Clara watched until he vanished into the trees. For a long moment the world was still again, only the crackle of her small fire breaking the silence. She turned back to her cabin, touching the new beam he'd fixed. It was straighter, stronger, solid in a way that made her chest ache with something she didn't quite understand. She told herself she didn't need his help. But as night fell and the wind began to howl, she found herself glancing toward the ridge, wondering if the silent rancher was still out there, watching over her. For several days after that first encounter, Clara saw no sign of him. The ridge stood empty, the trail undisturbed. She told herself it was for the best. She didn't need a man's interference or company. But sometimes, when the air was still, she caught herself glancing toward the hills, listening for the faint rhythm of hooves that never came. Then one morning, while hauling water from the creek, she heard the creak of leather and turned to see him again. Luke Calder. Astride that same chestnut horse, a shadow against the rising sun. He dismounted without a word, his movements easy, deliberate, the kind that came from long years of hard work. "Morning," Clara said cautiously, shielding her eyes. He nodded once. "Morning," that was it. No explanation for his return, no apology for the last time, just that single word. Then he walked past her and began stacking the logs she'd cut, setting them into a neat pile as though he'd been hired to do it. Clara frowned. "I didn't ask for help." He didn't look up. "Didn't say you did." There was something maddening about his calmness, how he moved through her space like he belonged there, silent and sure. Yet, as the morning stretched on, she found herself working beside him, wordlessly falling into rhythm. When she strained to lift a log, his hand appeared beside hers, steadying the weight without comment. When she fumbled with a notch, he corrected it quietly. showing her with patient precision rather than words. By noon, sweat dampened both their shirts, and Clara was forced to admit something. With him there, the work went faster. The walls climbed higher, the structure sturdier than before. But Luke never stayed to rest. As soon as the sun dipped low, he wiped his hands on a rag, gave her a nod, and left without so much as a goodbye. Over the next week, it became a rhythm she couldn't ignore. He'd appear at dawn, silent as mist, help her work through the day, and leave when dusk touched the trees. He never lingered, never crossed into her small circle of comfort, but his presence filled the emptiness she'd once grown used to. And though he spoke little, Clara began to notice the language of his silence. When he handed her tools, he met her gaze long enough to make her chest tighten. When her hands blistered again, he wordlessly wrapped them with a strip of cloth from his own sleeve. When she tripped carrying a heavy log, he caught her by the waist, just for a heartbeat, and then stepped back, jaw tight, eyes shadowed. The man carried something inside him, something heavy and private. His silences weren't cold. They were protective, almost reverent. One evening, when the sky turned rose and gold, she found him sitting near the fire she'd built, sharpening his knife. She decided to break the quiet. "You always help strangers this way, Mr. Calder?" He looked up, a faint flicker of surprise in his eyes. "Not usually. Then why me?" she asked. His gaze dropped back to the knife. The firelight danced across the hard lines of his face. After a long pause, he said softly, "You're building something worth standing beside." That was all. He rose soon after, saddled his horse, and rode off toward the darkening hills. Clara sat long after he was gone, staring at the place where he'd sat, his words echoing in her mind. Worth standing beside. No one had ever said something like that to her, not her husband, not the townsfolk who doubted her. From that night on, she didn't see Luke as a stranger. He was still quiet, still distant, but she sensed a kind of shared solitude between them. Two people bruised by the past, learning how to build something new, not just from wood and nails, but from patience, from understanding, from silence that no longer felt empty. As she drifted to sleep that night, Clara thought of the wordless man on the ridge and the steady comfort of his presence. For the first time in months, she didn't feel completely alone. The days that followed fell into a rhythm, slow and steady as a heartbeat. Clara and Luke worked side by side from dawn until dusk, the steady sounds of hammering, sawing, and splitting wood filling the clearing. The cabin began to rise from the earth, each log fitted with care, each joint sealed tight against the coming cold. It was no longer a pile of lumber. It was becoming a home, but as the walls grew higher, something else took root between them. Something quieter, harder to name. Luke was still a man of few words. His silences long and deep, yet Clara had learned to read them. She could tell the difference between his thoughtful quiet and his cautious one. She noticed the way his gaze lingered when he thought she wasn't looking, the flicker of respect when she lifted a heavy beam, the faint curve of amusement when she muttered at a stubborn nail. He didn't tell stories, not about himself or his past, but he listened when she talked. Sometimes, as they worked, she filled the air with words. About her husband who died too young, about how she'd come west with nothing but a dream and a small inheritance. She confessed she was terrified she'd fail, that the winter would crush her spirit. Luke never interrupted, never offered hollow comfort. He just listened, eyes steady, jaw set, and somehow that was enough. At night, when the work was done, he would linger by the fire she built outside. The sky stretched wide above them, black velvet scattered with stars. Sometimes he'd whittle small pieces of wood into shapes. Birds, horses, once a tiny cabin she found one morning sitting by her doorstep. He never said it was his doing, but she knew. One evening, after a long day of work, Clara burned her hand reaching for a hot kettle. She hissed in pain, jerking back. Before she could even grab a cloth, Luke was there, kneeling beside her, his hand gentle but sure as he wrapped her palm in cool, damp fabric. "You've got to be careful," he said softly, his voice rough, low. It startled her, the first words he'd spoken all day. "I've managed worse," she whispered, embarrassed at how her heart fluttered under his touch. "I can tell," he murmured, a faint smile tugging at his mouth. For a heartbeat, neither of them moved. The air between them felt charged, the crackle of the fire mixing with something deeper. Then, as if realizing how close they were, he let go abruptly and stood, turning his face toward the darkness beyond the firelight. That night, Clara lay awake long after he'd gone. She traced her bandaged hand and thought of his quiet strength, the way his voice sounded when he finally chose to use it. There was something broken in him. She could sense it, some shadow he carried that made him keep his distance. But she also knew he was kind, and lonely, and human. As the days shortened and the nights grew colder, the cabin neared completion. They built the roof together, sealing every gap, nailing down shingles until their arms ached. When they stood back to look at their work, Clara felt a swell of pride so fierce it made her throat ache. "We did it," she said softly. Luke just nodded, his eyes tracing the structure with quiet satisfaction. "You did," he said. She smiled faintly. "You helped." His gaze met hers then, steady, unreadable. "Didn't plan to," he admitted, "just couldn't ride past." Something unspoken lingered between them. Gratitude, longing, maybe both. That evening, when the sun sank behind the mountains and the valley filled with golden light, Clara caught herself thinking that the cabin wasn't the only thing being built out there in the wilderness. Log by log, word by word, something stronger was forming, something fragile but real. Neither of them dared name it yet. But it was there, as solid as the cabin walls around them, and as fragile as the silence they shared. By the time October rolled in, the sky above the Montana Valley had turned the color of pewter, and the air smelled of snow. The cabin was almost finished. Sturdy walls, a solid roof, a stone hearth Luke had built himself. It wasn't perfect, but it was safe. Clara could finally imagine herself surviving the winter. She'd worked for this moment, bled for it. And now it stood before her, proof of her will and the quiet strength of the man who had helped her build it. That morning, the wind was restless, tugging at the trees like a warning. The clouds had gathered low and heavy, curling around the peaks like dark smoke. Clara stood outside, splitting wood, when Luke's horse trotted into view. He dismounted quickly, eyes scanning the sky. "Storm's coming fast," he said, his tone more urgent than usual. "You've got maybe an hour." She looked up, heart tightening. "That soon?" He nodded, already grabbing the stacked lumber and moving it toward the cabin wall. "We need to brace the roof beams. If the wind takes them, it'll tear half this place down." Without argument, she joined him. They worked side by side in silence, racing the storm. The wind howled louder, whipping through the clearing, carrying with it sharp flakes of ice that stung Clara's face. Luke climbed the ladder to secure the last beam, his movements precise and strong despite the gusts. Clara held it steady below, her hands numb from cold. Then the first thunder cracked, deep, rolling like the mountains themselves growling. The sky opened up, unleashing a torrent of freezing rain that turned to sleet. Luke shouted something she couldn't hear, then jumped down, grabbing her arm. "Inside, now!" They stumbled into the half-finished cabin, slamming the door just as the storm hit in full fury. The wind roared outside, shaking the walls so hard that dust rained from the rafters. The door rattled against its hinges, the storm clawing to get in. Luke braced his shoulder against the frame, muscles straining. "Help me hold it!" Clara rushed to his side, pressing her body against the wood, the cold seeping through the cracks. Together they held fast, the door jerking violently under the force of the wind. Outside, branches snapped, and hail beat against the roof like fists. "Will it hold?" she gasped. "It has to," he said, voice tight. For endless minutes, they fought the wind together. Their hands brushed, their breath came ragged and close, the world reduced to the sound of the storm and the pounding of their hearts. Then a sudden gust slammed the wall hard enough to make the beams creak. Clara flinched, her strength faltering. Luke shifted, wrapping one arm around her waist to steady her. "Easy," he murmured. "I've got you." The words were quiet, but they cut through the roar like warmth through cold. She felt his heartbeat against her back, steady, solid. And for the first time since she'd begun this journey, she wasn't afraid. Hours passed before the wind finally began to die. When the storm eased to a whisper, they stood in silence, still pressed together, the faint glow of the hearth flickering over their faces. Slowly, Luke let go and stepped back, his expression unreadable. "You all right?" he asked softly. Clara nodded, breath shaky. "Thanks to you." He gave a small nod, glancing toward the roof. "Cabin held better than I expected." She smiled faintly. "Guess we make a good team." Luke didn't answer, but his gaze lingered a heartbeat too long before he turned away, feeding another log into the fire. The flames caught, crackling bright and warm, casting long shadows that danced across the walls they'd built together. Clara watched him from across the room, her heart full of things she didn't dare say. That night, as the storm raged itself to sleep outside, she lay awake listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing near the fire. The cabin had survived the storm, but something inside her had changed too. She no longer worked just to stay alive. Now, for the first time, she wanted to live. When the storm finally passed, the land around the cabin looked as though it had been struck by a giant's hand. Trees split, branches scattered, and snow crusted in uneven drifts across the clearing. But the cabin stood firm, smoke rising from its chimney in thin gray ribbons. Clara Dawson stepped outside into the cold morning light, her breath forming clouds before her. For the first time in weeks, she felt something like peace. Luke Calder was already outside, repairing a fence post the wind had snapped. His coat was dusted with frost, his hat pulled low. He didn't notice her watching him, or if he did, he pretended not to. That was Luke's way, steady, dependable, and always keeping a part of himself hidden. "Looks like she held," Clara said, gesturing to the cabin. He gave a small nod. "Stronger than most folks thought she'd be," she smiled. "You mean stronger than you thought?" For the briefest moment, he smiled too. "Didn't say that." They worked side by side through the morning, clearing branches and salvaging supplies. But as the day wore on, Clara couldn't shake the sense that something in Luke had shifted. He was quieter than usual, his eyes distant, his words clipped short. When she offered him stew for lunch, he thanked her softly but didn't eat much. It wasn't until later. When a horse appeared on the trail, a sleek black mare ridden by a man in a long brown coat, that Clara understood why. The rider drew close, reining in beside the cabin. He looked like the kind of man who smiled only when money was involved. His mustache was neat, his boots polished, his smirk practiced. "Afternoon," he said, tipping his hat. "Name's Eli Granger. I'm the land agent for this part of the territory." Clara straightened, wiping her hands on her apron. "Land agent? I've got my deed, Mr. Granger. Everything's in order." He smiled wider, though it never reached his eyes. "About that. Seems there's a little mix-up in the county records. Your claim wasn't properly filed after your husband's passing. Technically, this land's unclaimed." Her heart lurched. "That's not true. My husband left it to me in his will." "Oh, I'm sure he did, ma'am. But wills don't mean much without signatures in the right place." He leaned forward in his saddle. "I'd hate for you to lose all this after all your hard work. Tell you what, I'll make it easy. I'll buy it from you. Fair price." Luke's shadow fell across the snow between them. "She's not selling." Eli looked down at him, smirk turning sharp. "Well, if it isn't the Calder boy. Didn't think I'd see you up this way again." Clara glanced between them. "You know each other?" Eli laughed lightly. "Everyone knows Luke Calder. Used to run a fine ranch before the fire." He tilted his head. "Tell me, Luke, you ever build anything that didn't burn down?" Luke's jaw tightened, his eyes darkening. "You'd best ride on, Granger." Eli's tone cooled. "Just trying to help the lady. Be ashamed to see her lose everything. Again?" When he finally turned and rode off, the sound of his horse's hooves echoed like thunder. Clara turned to Luke, confusion and anger mixing in her chest. "What did he mean? About a fire?" Luke said nothing. He just bent to pick up a fallen beam, his face turned away. "Luke," she pressed, stepping closer. "Tell me." He froze, then shook his head. "Doesn't matter." "It matters to me." His voice came low, rough. Let it go, Clara. And with that, he walked toward his horse, mounted, and rode off into the hills, his figure fading into the same lonely ridge where she'd first seen him months ago. Clara stood in the snow, the wind biting her cheeks, her heart heavy with questions. The man who had helped her build everything she had was suddenly gone, and she didn't even know why. That night, alone by the fire, she stared at the unfinished journal on her table. The silence felt different now, emptier, colder. The cabin still stood strong, but the space inside it had never felt so hollow. The days after Luke's departure stretched on like an endless winter. The cabin that had once been full of quiet comfort now felt unbearably empty. Clara worked from dawn until dark just to fill the silence, mending fences, chopping wood, cleaning, anything to keep her hands busy and her mind from drifting toward the ridge where she'd last seen him ride away. But no matter how she tried to ignore it, the ache of his absence followed her like a shadow. She caught herself glancing toward the hills whenever she stepped outside, half expecting to see that chestnut horse appear again. Each night she told herself she didn't need him, that she had survived worse, that she'd built this life on her own. But deep down she knew the truth. She missed him. Not just his strength or his help, but the quiet steadiness he brought, the peace she'd found in his company. 3 days later, trouble returned before he did. She woke to the acrid smell of smoke and the faint orange glow dancing on the horizon. At first, she thought it was dawn, but the light was wrong, pulsing and wild. Her heart seized. Fire. By the time she reached the clearing's edge, the truth hit her hard. Flames were spreading through the brush, carried by a fierce wind blowing straight toward her cabin. Somewhere beyond the ridge, she could hear men shouting, horses snorting. And among them, a familiar voice. Eli Granger panic surged through her. She ran back to the cabin, grabbed her bucket and began hauling water from the creek, throwing it against the walls, trying to douse the sparks that leapt from the wind. But it was hopeless. The fire was too fast, too fierce. The heat burned her cheeks and her lungs filled with smoke. Then, over the roar of the blaze, she heard the pounding of hooves. "Clara!" She turned and saw him, Luke, riding hard through the smoke, his coat whipping behind him, eyes blazing with urgency. He leapt off his horse before it even stopped, grabbed a blanket from his saddlebag, and threw it over the nearest flame. "What are you doing here?" she cried, coughing. He didn't answer. He just moved beside her, fighting the fire with desperate focus. Together they worked, hauling water, stamping embers, choking on smoke until her arms felt like lead. The flames finally began to die, leaving behind smoldering ash and the charred remains of part of her fence. When the last of it faded, Clara sank to her knees, trembling. "It was him," she whispered. "Eli did this." Luke dropped beside her, breathing hard. His face was streaked with soot, his shirt damp with sweat. "I know," he said hoarsely. "He's been trying to scare you off this land." She turned to him, tears stinging her eyes. "Then why didn't you tell me? Why did you leave?" For a long time he didn't speak. The fire's dying embers painted his face in flickering red light. Then finally his voice came low, broken. "Because of another fire," he said. "The one Eli was talking about." Clara froze, watching him as he stared into the ashes. "Years ago," he went on, "my ranch house caught fire in the night. My wife and son were inside. I tried to save them, but—" His voice faltered. "I wasn't fast enough. I pulled them out too late. I never forgave myself for that. I stopped talking. Stopped living, just worked until I forgot to feel anything at all." Tears blurred Clara's vision. She wanted to reach for him, but didn't know if she had the right. He shook his head, his voice barely a whisper now. "When I saw you building that cabin, I thought, maybe I could help someone build something that didn't burn. Maybe that would make up for what I lost. But I shouldn't have stayed. I don't deserve this." She reached out then, placing her hand over his, her fingers trembling. "Luke," she said softly, "you can't rebuild the past. But you can build something new with me, something that lasts." He looked at her, his eyes raw with pain. And for a long moment, neither spoke. The night was quiet except for the soft hiss of dying embers. Then, at last, Luke squeezed her hand just once and whispered, "Then let's build it together." The fire had taken her fence. The land was blackened in places. But as they stood there in the smoke, Clara realized something vital. From ashes, new things could grow, and maybe, just maybe, they had both found a reason to begin again. The next morning dawned pale and gray, with smoke still clinging low over the valley. The fire had left scars, charred earth, a fence half burned, blackened stumps where young pines had stood, but the cabin still stood strong. Clara and Luke worked side by side in silence, shoveling dirt over the last of the smoldering embers. Every muscle in Clara's body ached, yet something inside her felt steadier than it had in weeks. When Luke had ridden away before, he'd taken her peace with him. But this time, as he moved beside her, calm and deliberate, she felt something different, a sense of partnership, of belonging. He was quieter than usual, though, his thoughts far away. She caught him glancing toward the ridge often, jaw tight, eyes scanning the horizon as though expecting someone to appear. He hadn't said it, but they both knew Eli Granger wouldn't stop with one fire. Men like him didn't understand the word no. After hours of work, Clara leaned against the shovel and wiped her brow. "You should go back to your ranch," she said finally. "If Granger's got it in for me, I won't drag you into it." Luke looked up from where he was repairing a post, his expression unreadable. "You think I'd ride away now?" he asked. "You don't owe me anything," she said quietly. He walked toward her, dust on his boots, soot still smudged across his cheek. "You're right," he said. "I don't owe you, but I'm not leaving." His gaze softened. "You stood your ground when everyone else told you to give up. I reckon that deserves someone to stand with you." Clara swallowed hard, a lump rising in her throat. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The wind shifted, carrying the faint scent of pine through the charred air. That night, Luke didn't leave the ridge. He tethered his horse near the barn and helped her finish boarding up the window the fire had cracked. When darkness fell, he built a small campfire out front, keeping watch. The quiet between them wasn't heavy anymore. It was comfortable, like two people who'd fought the same storm and come out standing. As the fire crackled, Luke finally broke the silence. "Eli's not done," he said flatly. "He'll come again, and next time, he won't light a fire from a distance." "He'll come himself," Clara nodded, staring into the flames. "Then let him. I'm done running." Her voice carried a strength Luke hadn't heard before. She wasn't just the determined widow who'd set out to build a cabin anymore. She was someone reborn in flame and grit. He felt a swell of respect deep in his chest. The next day they prepared. Luke rode into town and returned with supplies, more nails, lumber, ammunition, and 2 rifles. He spoke little of what he'd seen there, but the way his jaw tightened told Clara enough. Eli Granger had been boasting in the saloon, spreading lies about taking back what was his. Clara met Luke's eyes when he returned. "We'll be ready," she said simply. They worked until sunset, strengthening the fences, setting up a lookout from the cabin's porch, and clearing brush that could be set alight again. Every sound of hammer or saw seemed to echo their defiance into the mountains. When the stars came out, Luke sat on the porch beside her. His hat was tipped low, his hands resting loosely around a mug of coffee. The world was quiet, save for the night insects and the creek murmuring through the valley. "You ever think," Clara said softly, "that maybe this land doesn't want to be tamed?" Luke gave a small, rare smile. "Maybe, but I think it respects those who try." Their eyes met in the soft starlight, and something unspoken passed between them, something stronger than words, quieter than promises. Then from somewhere in the dark came the distant echo of horses. Luke stiffened instantly, setting down his mug. "They're coming." Clara rose to her feet, calm and steady. "Then it's time to show them this land already has a keeper." Luke handed her the rifle and nodded once. "And she's not alone anymore." They stood shoulder to shoulder on the porch as the sound of hooves grew louder, their silhouettes framed by the light from inside the cabin, their home, their stand, their shared fight. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The night fell heavy and dark, the kind of darkness that swallowed sound. Even the crickets had gone quiet. The only light came from the lantern hanging beside the cabin door, its glow trembling against the wooden walls. Clara stood beside Luke on the porch, her rifle steady in her hands, her heartbeat a drum in her chest. The sound of horses grew louder. 4, maybe 5. Their hooves struck the earth in hard, deliberate rhythm. Luke's expression hardened into stone. He'd seen this kind of moment before, men riding in with trouble on their minds, drunk on greed and arrogance. He could smell it in the wind. "Stay behind me," he murmured. Clara shook her head. "Not this time." Her voice was steady, eyes sharp. "This is my land." "My fight." He glanced at her, just once, but what he saw in her face silenced any protest. She wasn't afraid. She was resolute, a woman who had built a life from bare soil and sorrow. Together, they stepped off the porch and waited. The riders came into view through the darkness, their outlines flickering in the lantern light. Eli Granger was at the front, his smirk visible even from yards away. He sat tall in the saddle, hat tipped low, one hand resting on his gun. Behind him, 3 rough-looking men followed, faces mean, eyes glinting with the kind of hunger that came from easy cruelty. "Well, well," Eli drawled, reining in his horse. "Didn't think I'd find company out here. Guess you finally got tired of pretending to be a ranch hand, Mason." Luke didn't answer. He stood still, rifle pointed low but ready. His silence seemed to infuriate Eli. Eli spat in the dirt. "You think you can protect her? You couldn't even protect your own." The words hit their mark like a knife. Clara saw Luke's jaw tighten, his eyes flash. She stepped forward, voice clear and cold as river ice. "You set my land on fire. You tried to scare me off. But I'm still here, Mr. Granger. I'm not leaving and I'm not selling. So you can turn around and ride back the way you came, or we can end this now." Her words hung in the air, sharp as the edge of a blade. Eli's laughter was low and cruel. "You think you can stop me, girl? You and your broken rancher here?" He gestured to his men. "Take her off this land. Burn the rest if you have to." But before they could move, Luke raised his rifle. The sound of the cocking lever snapped through the stillness like thunder. "One more step," he said quietly, "and you'll never take another." Something in his tone stopped them cold. The men shifted uneasily, glancing at one another. Eli hesitated, realizing perhaps too late that this wasn't the same silent man he'd once mocked in town. Luke Mason's eyes burned with purpose now, with the fire of someone who'd lost everything once and refused to lose again. The standoff stretched long and breathless. The wind hissed through the grass. Somewhere an owl called. Finally, Eli's smirk faltered. "You'll regret this," he spat, yanking his reins. "You'll both regret it." He turned his horse sharply and his men followed, their silhouettes disappearing into the night. The sound of hooves faded, leaving only the quiet hum of the prairie behind. Clara's knees weakened with relief, and she let out a long breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Luke lowered his rifle slowly, his eyes still fixed on the horizon. "He'll be back," she said softly. Luke nodded. "Maybe. But next time he won't find fear here." The lantern flickered, and the two of them stood together in its glow, side by side, their shadows long and intertwined across the dirt. The danger wasn't gone, but something deeper had taken root. Trust. When the first light of dawn began to touch the valley, Clara turned to Luke. "You didn't have to stay," she said quietly. He looked at her, voice rough but certain. "Didn't have to. Wanted to." And for the first time since that terrible fire years ago, Luke Mason smiled, a real quiet smile. The night had tested them both, but it hadn't broken them. It had forged them. The dawn came softly that morning, painting the horizon in gold and rose. The storm had passed, the smoke had thinned, and for the first time in what felt like forever, peace settled over the valley. Clara stepped outside the cabin, the cold boards creaking beneath her bare feet, and breathed in the clean scent of pine and dew. The land around her, blackened in places, scarred but alive, seemed to glow beneath the morning light. It was as if the earth itself was waking from a long, hard fight. Behind her, she heard the slow creak of the door. Luke stepped out, still barefoot, his shirt sleeves rolled up, the shadows beneath his eyes softer now. He looked out over the land, the same land he'd once thought cursed by his past, and said quietly, "Looks like it's healing." Clara turned toward him, a small smile tugging at her lips. "So are we." He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached down, picked up a handful of soil, and let it run through his fingers. "You were right, you know," he said finally, "about building something new." She tilted her head, studying him. The man who had once been little more than a ghost, quiet, burdened, hollow, was changing before her eyes. The silence that had once surrounded him wasn't the heavy kind anymore. It was peaceful, whole. They spent the morning repairing what the fire had damaged. Luke rebuilt the fence line while Clara swept the ashes from the porch. There was a rhythm to it, two steady hearts working in time. The quiet between them wasn't filled with grief now, but with purpose. By midday, they stopped to rest beneath the porch's shade. Luke passed her a tin cup of water. She drank deeply, wiped her mouth, and glanced at him with that soft, knowing smile she'd begun to wear whenever she looked his way. "What happens now?" she asked. Luke leaned back against the rail, hat tipped low over his brow. "Now we finish what you started," he said simply. "We build this cabin right. A roof that won't leak, walls that won't burn, a place that'll stand long after we're gone." Something in his tone made her heart swell. He wasn't just talking about lumber and nails anymore. Later that afternoon, the neighbors came, people from Pine Creek who'd once whispered that Clara Dawson was a fool for trying to build alone. They came with tools and supplies, with words of apology and offers of help. News of Eli Granger's retreat had already spread. Some said he'd left town for good. The law was finally taking interest in his accidents. Clara accepted the help with quiet grace. When someone asked who the silent man beside her was, she looked at Luke and smiled. "He's my partner," she said, "in more ways than one." The words hung in the air, warm and sure. Luke's eyes met hers, and something unspoken passed between them, something that had been waiting to bloom since the day he first rode up to her half-built cabin. That evening, when the last nails were hammered and the final plank laid, the cabin stood tall and proud. Not perfect, but real. A symbol of everything they had endured and everything they had chosen. As the sun dipped low behind the ridge, Clara stood on the porch beside Luke, watching the light fade across the land. She reached for his hand, and he didn't hesitate. Their fingers laced together naturally, as though they had been meant to fit all along. "This is home," she said softly. Luke squeezed her hand, his voice low. "It is now." They stayed there until the stars appeared, two silhouettes framed against the glow of their cabin, the wind whispering through the pines like a song of promise. The woman who had once built her dream one log at a time had found something stronger than walls and timber. She had found a man who understood silence and sorrow, who helped her turn both into strength, and together they had built not just a cabin, but a life rooted in second chances, steady hands, and love born quietly in the wilderness, love that would last longer than any storm.